Hello and welcome to the latest digital media review from Conservative Progress with me, Jason Mackenzie, with Alan O'Kelly, also from Conservative Progress, and with our guest, Matt Gillow, the co-founder of 1828. For those of you that aren't familiar with the format, it's really simple. We pick three pieces of digital media from politics or from the wider web, and we kick them around. And this week we're looking at a piece by Nick Jensen for Reaction called "We Don't Need to Be Patronized by Woke Corporations Telling Us What to Think." We're also looking at a Twitter thread from Konstantin Kisin, one of the co-hosts of the Trigonometry podcast, which, if you haven't seen it, is well worth watching and or listening to. And Paul Goodman took Konstantin's Twitter thread and republished it in full with a little bit of editorial perspective on it. And the final article we're looking at today is published on Unheard. It's by Ed West, and it's entitled "Why the Rich Are Revolting," the subtitle being "The Great Awakening and the 2020 Protests Are the Product of Growing Radicalization Amongst the Upper Middle Class." So it goes without saying, woke is a bit of a theme for us today. And I should also just say that we are recording this on Friday early evening. So if anything's happened at the weekend before Sunday morning when you're possibly watching this, that's because we aren't prophets and we can't see into the future. So first of all, I want to throw it over to our guest, Matt. Tell us about your piece and why it caught your eye.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you for having me. Pleasure to join you both. So I've got a piece in Reaction by Nick Jensen. As Jason said, it's titled "We Don't Need to Be Patronized by Woke Corporations Telling Us What to Think." So obviously it's something that's become a bit of a talking point throughout kind of the Black Lives Matter protests. We've had, everyone up to, PG Tips and Yorkshire Tea and stuff on Twitter taking a stand on these protests and giving their opinion. And you've also got obviously the recent Hong Kong situation with banks such as HSBC coming out and being at the centre of a bit of a storm, by coming out in support of the national security law. So it's something that's increasingly been a phenomenon for the past few years. So I've got a quote that kind of sums up, I think, what Nick's take on it is. So he says, "On the face of it, there's nothing intrinsically wrong with institutions taking principled stands against aspects of society with which they disapprove. But we should be profoundly suspicious whenever big business suddenly develops a social conscience. In the pursuit of growth, market share, customer satisfaction, and brand development, corporations are prepared to absorb and then regurgitate almost any modern day trend, fashion, or faddery." So yeah, no, it's really interesting piece, well written. I'm actually kind of I don't know if you want to jump into opinions on it just yet, Jason, but I'm actually of the opinion I probably take the other view. I've written a few times kind of about the era of the woke brand, and I'm kind of the camp that I think it shows some of the best of the free market system. First of all, brands aren't adopting these positions independently. They're driven by social pressure, right? Pressure from shareholders, pressure from customers. And for me, that's one of the best aspects of the free market kind of in action, brands trying to be more sustainable, diverse, or whatever in response to consumer and customer preference. And I find it quite funny when people take kind of such strong exception to this idea of big brands telling them what to do, because, at the end of the day, if it offends them so much, they can, if you will, vote with their wallets and kind of look elsewhere. And I think, that's quite an important element of what we support in a free market system,
So I had some feedback on the last one of these to say that bloke Luke, who's not here this week, and that bloke Alan, they agree on everything. And so we brought you in, Matt, because we hope that you'd bring fresh perspective and some argument. But you're going to find that you're amongst free market friends here. So if, I don't know, Brewdog does something which offends me, I don't need to buy their beer. I don't need to go to their pubs. If Sainsbury's does something which offends me, I can go to Waitrose or Tesco. And I'm a brand guy historically. I'm a brand and marketing guy by training. And my view is that as long as it's authentic, as long as that business, that brand wants to embrace a particular ethos and have a particular message and appeal to particular constituencies, then so be it. You know. My problem, and I think you used the word authenticity, my problem is that when it's inauthentic, when it's purely a gambit to try to broaden their appeal beyond their existing customer base or constituency, and it hasn't got any genuine passion behind it, because brands have got to be driven by values. They're not just a cosmetic veneer designed to make their proposition more attractive. And I can tell Alan's champing at the bit to get in, so...
Well, I think, yeah, actually, funny, I was all prepared to argue with Matt, and he turns around and agrees with disagrees with the piece. I think one problem, and you've hit the same point, Jason, is the problem is often when brands and companies, there's a big gap between what they say and what they do, you know, the deeds, not words type thing. And what we keep seeing, the problem with this is when companies just get it so badly wrong. Like, you know, you've seen... Pepsi a couple of years ago, really get rubbishing their own brand, which had actually been quite strong for a long time on civil rights, and one bad campaign. Starbucks in the past have done this, have gotten it pretty badly wrong. Gillette, I don't know if I remember the Gillette ad from 2 years ago about toxic masculinity. And that's the kind of problem that I agree completely that in some ways, brands can actually help shine a light on problems that might not get a voice. But I think the problem is when it's just bandwagon jumping. That can be where there's problems. But as Matt rightly says, at any point along the way, you're perfectly entitled to close your wallet and go home.
Yeah,
absolutely. So I haven't shopped. It will probably come as no surprise to you. I haven't shopped at the Body Shop for a very long time. But when they decided to have a go at J.K. Rowling for what seemed to me to be a fairly innocuous, common sense tweet and perspective, I put out a tweet saying, I wish I could boycott them. And it's okay to boycott them. It's okay to buy more of their products because they're opposing J.K. Rowling's view. And it's okay to not shop with them. We vote with our feet and with our wallet. And just to continue the woke theme, a quick plug, and it's not paid for Trigonometry. Trigonometry is this excellent podcast which is co-hosted by Konstantin Kisin and Francis Foster, and they tackle big issues with a really independent, free-thinking perspective. And Konstantin put out this Twitter thread essentially about the potential coming culture clash. And Paul Goodman at Conhome republished it in full and then just put a little editorial note saying that Konstantin's vision is apocalyptic and, in our view, I guess that's the editorial view of Conservative Home, overstated. But he says this thread is worth reproducing because it highlights some of the risks that recent events open up. And for those of you that are watching this perhaps and missed Konstantin's thread, essentially he writes this: you're going to hate me for writing this. You're going to resist what I say because you don't want it to be true. You're going to pretend that I want this to be true, when in fact there's nothing I hate more than the fact that it's come to this. Here's what happens next. And he goes on to paint a pretty grim picture of what potentially could happen if you have mobs tearing down or defacing statues, and you have the police stepping to one side and not enforcing law and order. And Boris tweeted this morning, and it was an 8-part thread, which was actually very prime ministerial, very balanced, very appealing, I think, certainly to everyone except for the anarchic left, who will intensely dislike him. But Konstantin says that we're potentially going to face a bloodbath if we don't have an opinion with regard to these issues. And we were just chatting before we went live, and Alan pointed out that the way to get a statue taken down is through the democratic process. The way to get a statue taken down is never to haul it down and break law. And I'm embarrassed to see that we've covered up the cenotaph with barricades, and we've covered up Churchill's statue with barricades. And I think what we're doing by doing that is yielding to anarchic and chaotic forces. So, I feel reasonably strongly about this. Matt, what do you think?
So, like, I think this may be the one aspect where we actually might get a little bit of not the three of us sat here are agreeing with each other. Like, I think he Constantine is right, and I think if we aren't already in our kind of like US imported culture war, then we're pretty close to it. But like I'm not, I wasn't 100% sure kind of what the thread was suggesting. He talks at the end about reversing the racialization of society, I think are the words he uses, which is one point, and that's great. But I think the aspect of it that I feel uncomfortable with, and I get that, in a lot of cases, people are feeling very angry and taking things quite far, and think, tensions are boiling over, and that's not something I'm a fan of. But I do feel uncomfortable with the idea that kind of left liberals and supporters of groups like Black Lives Matter should kind of, and this is what I took from the thread, be wary of feeling this anger and be wary of pushing through for change that you want to see, because if you do so, we might end up with the likes of Tommy Robinson, the likes of the EDL coming and scrapping kind of thing. And I think in some ways, I'd be interested to know what Alan thinks about this. Actually, I think it's a worrying point at which we go, maybe kind of wind your necks in, because there's going to be a bit of conflict if you don't. I'm interested to know what Alan thinks about that.
Yeah, I think it's a great point you just made. I think one of the things that struck me about that Twitter post, it was interesting, and it's interesting to think these things through. But like, I think what it essentially says is, there's one group that's pushing, they will then be met by another group on the other extreme who will push back, and do the bulk of us in the middle, who may not be, may not feel that we're, on one side, I don't say one side either, but don't feel we're part of either of these groups. Do we now have responsibility? Like, I think I think it's fair to say elements have hijacked the Black Lives Matter protest to their own ends, for violent ends. And there are, excuse my language, someone can beat me, arseholes in all organizations. And I'm not saying they're actually members of these organizations, but like, I think there's legitimate points here. And I think there's a danger that we start saying to people, well, you've had your moments, we can't really allow things to go any further. And I think, go back to the statue that was pulled down, Edwards Colston, I hope we got his name right. I mean, how long was that debate going on in Bristol before that was pulled down? I'm not saying it was right for people to take the law in their own hands. It isn't. But equally, that seemed to be going on for a very, very long time, and no one resolved it. And so this is what happens. And I think there's a danger that you're absolutely right. And Jason, it's an interesting point. There's going to be a backlash, or there could be a backlash. But equally, I think that's a call to us who might see ourselves as centrists to say, well, actually, who do we want to stand with here? And surely that means, we should be standing with peaceful protesters, the bulk of whom, were in maybe not all of them last weekend, but there was a lot of peaceful protesters there. We should be standing with as many as we can.
Yeah, as long as we're standing 2 meters apart, right? So here's three things I hope we can agree on. Number one, law and order is important, and the police should enforce law and order and the rule of law indiscriminately. Number two, yes, it's frustrating when a democratic process takes too long, but you don't just get frustrated and then resort to breaking the law. And number three, I would happily defend Karl Marx's statue from being defaced or torn down in the same way that I would happily defend Churchill's statue, with a caveat of I don't really want to get hurt. Can we agree on those three things, Matt?
So I would say the one, yes, generally. The one point is that, on the law and order point, I listened to, there was a really interesting, I think it was out on Tuesday actually, a really interesting podcast, the Times Red Box podcast, with a conversation with Matt Chorley and Mayor of Bristol, Marvin Rees. And there was a lot of debate about kind of, should the police have stepped in Bristol and stopped this? Because generally the police stood back and just kind of let it happen. And people in positions of power in Bristol have backed them up on that, even though Priti Patel came in and kind of had a harsh word. And I think, yes, law and order is important, but police are better placed when they're local police are better placed to appreciate the kind of intricacies and the nuances of that particular issue. And that's a factor that needs to be taken in. Like Alan said, this debate over Edward Colston has been going on for years and years. I'm not from Bristol. I'm from near Bristol. I have a lot of friends that live there, and it is a stain on the city. It has been a stain on the city. And, you know, whilst obviously police should step in generally and stop any protests that are kind of overboiling, I think in occasions like this, there is an element of respect for the situation and the city's culture that, you know, needs to be appreciated, rather than saying indiscriminately these things should be stopped and the police need to ratchet up their response to it.
Yeah,
I'm not after ratcheting up a response. No ratcheting up. I just want the rule of law.
Well, yeah, but I think, sorry, again, agree. I don't disagree with, but I think, I do think there's this point about, I think we have to be really careful that we don't import, like we're starting to import some of the American culture wars, but I also think we need to be careful that we don't import some of the, that we don't start importing as well some of the American policing strategies, which seem to be, let's just crack heads and let's just have an us versus them type strategy. And I think if we don't do that more, if we allow that to kind of happen, there's a real danger that the response to every policing situation is let's bash the, let's just start a riot, or let's have a robust response to everything. I think the response has to be trust the police. You know, there is a need to ensure that justice is seen to be served, but equally, I'm not a policing or crowd control expert. Surely we should let the guys who know what they're doing ensure that they get that we don't have least damage.
Okay, I'm going to draw a line under this one. Otherwise, we're going to get the truncheons out and the riot buttons. Alan, tell us why the rich are revolting.
Yeah, this is a really good piece by Ed West, and Ed is a writer who wrote a great book called Small Men on the Wrong Side of History, which is about the conservative movements. It's a really, really good book if you haven't read it. But he wrote a great piece. He's a deputy editor in Unheard, and there's a really, really good piece about who drives protests and who drives people getting involved. And this is it's more an analysis of where we are rather than anything else. But it's a really interesting point about his central argument, which I hope I have right. It's a very long piece, and so it's a really enjoyable long read. But it's the idea that actually revolts and revolutions tend actually not to be driven by what people tend to see as working class or poor people, but actually by middle class people and by even the upper middle class. And if you look through history, it's, you know, it points out like the French Revolution, Russian Revolution, and others, a lot of these are driven by other forces, by other people, by the upper middle class. And in fact, oftentimes the people they claim to be representing are nowhere near the top table or in the decision making. But you made a really interesting point about where we are now, and where it gets to is this idea that actually we're creating a generation of people who are not overqualified. That's not fair to say, but that there are too many people who are highly capable, highly trained, highly educated, but are chasing too few of what we consider elite positions. That not everyone can be at the top of a CEO tree. Not everyone can be at the, not everyone can be in Parliament simply because there's just not enough numbers. But yet there's a growing group of people who are looking at that, and that's their desire. And unmet ambition could lead to revolution, or could lead to people feeling left out of the process and driving it on. And it is a really, really interesting point. I've not really done it justice because it's a long and really detailed read, but it's a really interesting take on this, that, you know, it's not the people you think that are driving this. There's a different group that is actually involved.
I think it's always been true, right? So, you know, my profession is PR, and the guy who's often credited with being the founding father of PR is a guy called Edward Bernays. And Edward Bernays talked about the engineering of consent. He talked about the conscious mass manipulation of the people by a handful of elites, essentially. But the key difference between all of history and today is that since 2007, 2008, we've had social media. We've had two-way communication and genuine two-way communication, whereby anyone that's got an internet connection can have a dialogue, they can have a blog, they can engage on Instagram or Facebook or Twitter or wherever it might be. And so I challenge part of the premise of his historic argument, because, yes, certainly the upper middle classes have often held the reins of power and have instigated what appear to be grassroots movements or mass participation movements. But I would argue that's possibly less so today than it has been in any decade of human history up until this point. Matt, however, will probably have a much more nuanced perspective on this.
I doubt I'd be more nuanced, but I'm more eloquent, Justin, Jason. But probably two things that kind of pop into my head with regards to all of this is that, yeah, I completely agree with you. I think more than ever we are in this position where actually, you know, non-middle class people who typically have not had the resources to instigate movements themselves, and so it's been left to middle class benefactors, etc., you know, have now got the resources and the means to put their views out there, and you know, I think Black Lives Matter is a perfect example of this. You know, race and class and the debate on that, they are interlinked to an extent, and I think this is showing something that isn't just this middle class comfortable so-called revolution. This is something that is genuinely grassroots. But I would say actually what's interesting, and I don't think Ed touches on this in the piece, I'd echo Alan, it is a really, really interesting read, that he, you know, this isn't just like a Western phenomenon. Actually, if you look at, you know, China, I think from like the 80s and 90s, there was a bit of a discussion about kind of, oh, the growing Chinese middle class will lead to a democratic China or a more democratic China. And that hasn't happened. And I think actually that supports, you know, Ed's point even more in the sense that we're getting, you know, these middle classes have chosen for whatever reason, probably because they're comfortable and life is fine, that democracy is fine. And this mass movement for democracy hasn't happened in China. You know, so it's not necessarily just about the middle class choosing to revolt, but also not choosing to revolt, and therefore, you know, change not necessarily happening in undeveloped democracies that don't have the same resources and social media and things like that we do in the West.
I told you it was going to be more nuanced. Come on, Alan, what do you got?
Nothing more. That's the most insightful comment of the day. I think, yeah, I think, and come back to your point as well, Jason, I think the role of social media has probably changed, you know, people's kind of perceptions of things. I think the Chinese example is a good one. You know, you're absolutely right. For a long time, the idea was that middle class tends to move change along. And in fact, that, you know, doesn't seem to have happened. And the question will be whether that's an aberration or whether, you know, in kind of, you know, over time, whether that's an aberration or whether that's because something has fundamentally changed in our relationship with technology or the power of the state. But I think the question, I mean, the reason that the piece is so interesting is because it raises questions like that. And these are the type of things I think as a society, we do need to start thinking about is how we're engaging with each other again and how we ensure that everyone is being brought along into these conversations. Because otherwise we are going to see groups of people feeling disenfranchised and, you know, doing things that, you know, take leading causes and doing things that we may not agree with or want them to do. But and I'm not talking about anything that's happening at the moment, but in the future, we might see them moving in a direction we don't want to. And it's because people feel cut off from a wider society. So I think that's the balance. And yeah, I think Matt's point is a great one on the Chinese example.
Well, we almost managed a whole episode without talking about China. And, you know, it's normally Mr. Springthorpe that brings it in, but Matt's been so good, right? If I was Luke watching this, I'd be wondering if I'm going to get invited back.
What's back?
I'm going to wrap it up there. And just thank you, Matt, for joining us. Thank you also to Ed West from Unheard, or for the piece that he wrote for Unheard, Constant Kissin for his Twitter feed, which Con Home and Paul Goodman republished, and also for Nick Jensen for the article he wrote for Reaction. 3 interesting pieces with a theme, good discussion with you gents, very much appreciated, and thank you for watching. The final thing is, if you're watching this on YouTube, subscribe. We'll see you again next week.
Thanks for watching our video. And don't forget to like, subscribe and hit that notification bell.